Good afternoon, everyone. Good Friday afternoon. TGIF. My name is Guy Page. I'm the editor of the Vermont Daily Chronicle, and you are with us here on Friday at 4, the podcast of the Vermont Daily Chronicle. I'm here with our social media director, Paul Bean, and our reporter, Mike Belosky. Wow. Was there an awful lot of news this week? But first, you may have noticed, I don't normally wear hats on Friday at 4, but I am today. Make America Healthy Again. And first of all, it was a Christmas present, and I love it, from my beautiful bride. But the reason I'm wearing it is, if there was ever a time when America needed to think, and Vermonters, individuals, me, need to think about being healthy and doing what we can do to be healthy, it's now. Because we're looking at a 20% increase in healthcare costs. And I've been talking to some of the real smart people in the Statehouse about healthcare, and they're just kind of shaking their heads saying, not really sure where the solution's going to come from. So there's that. If we want to save money, if we want to help out our neighbors, be healthy, stay healthy, eat well, don't eat so much sugar, maybe drink a little bit less. Paul, I don't know if you noticed, but the liquor control person said that Vermonters actually are drinking less. A little bit less, but they're also
smoking.
Yes, they're smoking more pot.
I don't know if it is what it is.
Glass half full, glass half empty, kind of thing. Yeah. So also just north of the border, euthanasia in Canada is, I think it's now 1 out of 20 deaths is euthanasia. And so Vermont has assisted suicide. We're nowhere near like 1 in 20, but the letting people, easing them out of their pain, even if it kills them, is that's something that's happening more and more. So we might want to just be thinking about what can we ourselves do to be more healthy on an individual basis. So hat off. Thank you for indulging me in my little editorial/rant. So,
mind if I add a point, Guy?
Sure.
Just quickly, just want to say I've been a big believer in the Make America Healthy Again from the beginning, RFK from the beginning, and just think about healthcare costs. Sure, they might be increasing, but what are the costs right now of poor health choices? And I think it's almost impossible to calculate, because if you're eating well and you're exercising and you're taking care of your body, just think about how much clearer your thoughts are and how much more impactful your decisions and actions are. And I think when you're thinking more clearly, you're making better decisions. So how many bad decisions have been made on a bad stomach? You know what I mean?
That's right.
So it's just kind of a thing where, healthcare, it is going to increase the cost of it, but I think healthcare, what that means is changing, and it's going to continue to change. So I just wanted to add that. And quickly, folks, if there's any audio issues, anything at all, please tell us. If you can't see us, if you can't hear us, let us know in the chat. And how you can do that is if you're watching on X, you're watching on Facebook, you're watching on YouTube, just like any other way, you'd make a comment right in below your thoughts. And if you want to participate in our conversation today, please feel free to do so. We very much encourage it. We're all about free speech here at Vermont Daily Chronicle.
How do they do that?
What's that?
How do they do that? How do they interact?
Well, you just got to write below in the chat. If you're
gotcha.
watching,
okay.
If you're watching below, definitely, we want you to participate in the conversation. So please feel free to do so. And look at that guy. We already have a comment. RFK, are you serious? As an RN with 40 years of experience in healthcare, this man has no credibility when it comes to health or healthcare. Well, welcome to the show, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep them coming. Mike, you had something you wanted to say about that.
I haven't had trouble paying for health care in my time in Vermont. And I strongly believe this is because I opted from the very start to get out of health insurance. That solved all my problems, because now what I do is I go to, when I get sick or when we need an operation or something, we use charity care, which is the law. Every hospital in the country that gets any public money at all, which is most of them, have to take care of you, and they have to adjust the cost to your income. And most people have no idea about this unless you look in the waiting rooms at the hospital. They always tuck it in the corner. Not all of them do, but it's a little sign that says if you are afraid you cannot pay for your services, then we will adjust to your income. They have to do that by law. That's not them being sympathetic. And I've saved, well, I always joke with people, I'm like, we would not live in the house we live in today or have the cars we have or possibly even our children going to the school we have them going to now if we had chosen to just go with the health insurance like everyone else.
Right.
I've done the math in my head many times. I'm like, there's no way we would have our current life.
So you're taking charge of your own.
We take charge of our own.
Yeah.
We've taken the health insurance companies out of the equation and have gotten all the same, if not better, care for much lower cost for it.
Great.
And it drives me nuts that everybody doesn't do the same.
Thanks. So some of the story before we get into our top story, some of the stories that we're covering this week. Vermont. Oh man, there's so much news. First of all, just breaking today. A Norwich student dies on cold weather training. Tragic event. Read about it. Mike Donohue's story in Vermont Daily Chronicle. www.vermontdailychronicle.com. Also, the federal prosecutors indict a Hartford, Connecticut-based gang, a drug gang called Hoodstar GZZ, for St. Johnsbury shootings and drug crime. This gang's activities included murder, gun and drug trafficking, arson, and extortion, been part of an extensive RICO conspiracy. Also, shades of what was the okay, it'll come to me. But anyway, the state of Vermont accused of forcing an involuntary C-section on a mentally ill woman. You know, supposedly this is something that the state practiced, 100 years ago, where if there was a mentally ill person, they would make it harder for them to have a child, to raise a child. And here, the Department of Children and Families has been accused in a lawsuit filed by the ACLU of Vermont of trying to force a C-section on a mentally ill woman, an Elmore woman, at Copley Hospital in Morrisville. So that was a concerning story. And the same day that the story broke in Burlington about the man who went after a cop with a hatchet in the lobby of the Burlington Police Department. Governor Scott proposed his crime-fighting bills. It's funny, everyone in the legislature, they're focused on education, they're focused on energy. In the legislature right now, they're not so much talking about public safety. But the governor he laid out 4 bills that he wants to see. One is to be able to more easily revoke bail within constitutional limits, because our Constitution does lay out some guidelines about bail. To repeal the raise the age. Vermont, if nothing happens, Vermont this April will be the only state in the union to treat 19-year-olds as in juvenile court, to not try them as adults. And here, what's going on, if you look at this, the story we just referenced, the drug gang out of Hartford, Connecticut, there are teenagers being sent up here to be hitmen, to do all sorts of, crazy, deadly stuff. And we don't even have a juvenile facility right now, but some folks want to raise the age to make it harder for a criminal justice system to deal with violent felons who happen to be 19 years old. So he wants to take care of that. Also, this whole idea of expunging records. Expunging records means except for the really, really serious violent crimes, right now under state law, you can petition to have that record just basically totally wiped out. No one could ever know anything about that. And what the governor's saying is, don't so much expunge, but seal it, so that if the law enforcement needs to know, hey, so-and-so has a crime in their background, they can. Whereas under expungement, they can't. So again, this is giving one more tool to law enforcement to deal with our public safety problem. And the last thing he wants to do is, the fourth bill he wants to see passed is preventing judges from just suspending the sentences of violent offenders. And he said at a press conference, this happens more than you would think. So the governor is trying to do something there about law enforcement, and I think the legislature does too. I talked to the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he was a former state trooper, and he said that this whole bail thing and this whole catch and release, he told me it's number one on his list of priorities. We'll see, right?
Well, I'm just curious, I'm thinking about it. When I returned back to Vermont, you had mentioned to me that, I'm really covering this crime situation.
Public safety.
Public safety. And I was like, I know it's been bad, but I didn't realize how bad it really had been. I mean, we just almost get used to it, right? Like, oh, another crime headline, like whatever. But you're totally right. Like, everybody seems to be focused on all this other stuff. And not to say it's not important, but we have a serious crime problem in this state. And at what point do, people get held accountable for not taking these things seriously? Right. And I think the governor, I can't help but to wonder if some of the stuff you've been doing and some of the stuff we've been publishing has raised questions for everybody,
Well, I certainly hope so.
Yeah,
Paul and Mike.
I think
so.
I think it has. I think it has.
Yeah, because that's part of what media is supposed to do is, raise questions, provide information, and we can't make things happen. So it's not our job, but we can certainly talk about it and hope that those in authority act. Now, speaking of acting, I want to, it isn't acting, it's taking an action. That's how I meant it. I want to honor one of our sponsors. This show doesn't happen, folks, without sponsors. Thank God for the sponsors. Procter Gas, the propane people, owned and operated by our good friend and supporter, Judy Taranovich. The team at Procter Gas has more than 100 years of combined experience in the propane industry and is dedicated to bringing the best possible services, products, and customer care to residents throughout Vermont. And it is the fuel dealers and the oil dealers and the propane dealers who have an X painted on their back by the folks who are pushing the clean heat standard. And you attended a big hearing on some important news about the clean heat standard, which is the state's legislature's effort to have the fossil fuel dealers essentially pay for transition to electric heat, and thereby, in some cases, maybe putting themselves out of business. Paul, what can you tell us about this meeting this week?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say I love the transparency. That's who we're funded by. We know what we're doing here, and this is the stuff we want to cover. And there's a whole lot of fuel dealers out there, small family businesses that I know, people that are very much dependent on to keep people warm in Vermont. And they're watching this bill very closely, and they have been for a really long time. That includes the Fuel Dealers Association, who Matt Cota, he was there attending that joint hearing between the Senate Natural Resources and House Energy. I think so. I'm pretty sure it's House Energy.
Yes.
But I was there, and man, there's so many things I could say, but the big takeaway that I had walking out of it, and I also spoke with Allison Despathy, who's a writer of ours, if people are familiar with her. We both were just, I don't want to say confused, but we were a little confused about the direction that the PUC was going with it, other than really the big takeaway, which is them saying, and one of the commissioners saying that it's not well suited for the state of Vermont, this clean heat standard. And it's, when you're listening there, we had two different presentations, at least from what I saw from when I was there, and I did listen to the whole meeting. I had to jet at one point, but it was very detail oriented, but still so much ambiguous information coming from them, the PUC, that is.
Intentionally so, do you think?
Yes.
They're just not sure yet either.
Well, I think that what their thing is it's like they're trying to be, and the guy, I believe is McNamara.
McNamara?
McNamara. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. It's
McNamara.
McNamara.
Yeah.
what he said is, I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer, and he said that multiple times.
Yeah.
And if you want, we can bring somebody back who is an economist and give more explanation on these numbers. But one of the numbers he mentioned was this $956 million over 10 years, almost $1 billion over 10 years. That's going to cost the state of Vermont just to implement the program. That's the costs of the program. They haven't worked out the numbers on the participant's cost, meaning you who is paying for your heat. They're kind of real shaky on that. Nobody seems to know the answer to that.
Huh.
So,
wow.
Yeah, I don't know. What else, Guy? What else you want to know about it?
Well, from what I talked to Matt Cota today, and people have been trying to, that's the $1 million question, right? What's this thing going to cost? And the people who support it say, oh, just pennies, just pennies. Yeah. And folks like Myers Mamel, formerly of the Ethan Allen Institute, saying, actually, and some other consultants as well, actually saying, it could cost add $4 a gallon. And the number that Ed McNamara and others in the Public Utilities Commission threw out is up to 58 cents per gallon, maybe $300 a year. And which partly we're thinking, phew, not $4 a gallon. But I don't know, what do you think of that, Paul? That whole idea of, oh, maybe it's not so much.
Well, it's kind of like what they were saying with the property tax increase of 20%, and then them telling us, oh, but it's on sale. We're just kidding. It's only going to be 13%. We've worked out. We've moved some money around. It's only going to be a 13% property tax increase. But the reality is you're still paying for it in other ways.
Right.
So they're saying, oh, well, it's not going to be that $4 a gallon figure, but it's only 58 cents a gallon. Well, it's still more money, period.
Right.
And the people, the ratepayers, and you are going to have to pay more, period.
Right.
And when if this didn't exist at all, you never would have. And one of the constant arguments I always hear about the clean heat standard is, the fuel industry is volatile and it's extremely expensive, and
prices do go up and down.
They do, but it's purposefully right now.
Yeah.
Because they're pushing nationally and internationally this green initiative for the climate.
Right.
And so, of course, the fuel market's going to be volatile. The fuel dealers and people that are producing gasoline and heating fuel, they don't know the certainty of their future. And that kind of draws into some of the stuff that John Rogers and I were talking about this week. Was
you had an interview with him, right?
I did. I had an interview with Lieutenant Governor John Rogers. We'll have to talk maybe a little bit more about that later. But this whole thing with Trump being after Canada and Greenland and really the Arctic Circle as a whole, it's like, well, these ice caps apparently are melting, but one of the big reasons they want to get up there is because of all the oil and the resources. That's one of the big, and it's not just in Greenland, but Canada specifically, lots of oil there. So I'm not really sure what the whole argument is about the oil industry being, I know it's volatile, but it's artificially expensive.
Right.
And that's the problem.
There's market forces are one thing, but intentionally imposing higher costs so people won't buy it anymore, that's a whole different story, and that's what the clean heat standard's all about. Mike, you're going to say something?
I just want to remind about many years ago, I don't even know if he's even alive anymore, but Lindsey Williams, he was about 3 decades ago, he wrote a book called The Energy Non-Crisis. Lindsey Williams was a pastor for Atlantic Richfield, one of the big oil conglomerates. And if you can't tell from the title of the book, The Energy Non-Crisis, the gist of it was that the biggest oil companies, not your little mom and pops like here in Vermont, but the big ones like your Shell and whatnot, they all want the carbon taxes. They want the green movement because they're in on it. They want to get rid of the small competition so they can have it all to themselves. That was his message. This is like 20 years ago, so he was ahead of his time, I think.
Mike, it's very interesting you should say that, because on a Vermont scale, there are people who know a lot about this who are saying that, for example, Vermont Gas, which is a huge company by Vermont standards, is all over the idea of the clean heat standard because they have the financial capacity and the wherewithal to actually get on board this, whereas mom and pop fuel dealers, forget it. So in a way, they're like thinking, bring it on. That's a good point, Mike.
Well, I've heard a lot of this too. Is some of the big oil companies, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, they're they're seeking, if this is the direction things are going to go, well, they're going to figure out how to get themselves in a position
Right.
where they're still going to be the energy producers, right? I mean, look, the petrodollar dollar, the oil industry as a whole, it's what runs the world, and
Yeah.
I don't see it going
No,
away
they're
anytime.
not going to put it out of business.
No, they're not going to put it out of business. They might be happy to, once again, like, as you mentioned, put out these small dealers, but they're not the big oil tycoons. They still have a ton of money and power, and that's not changing anytime soon. And for like, whether you like it or not, I mean, I have plenty of criticisms of the oil industry, and I'm sure we all could talk about that. But the reality is, we live in Vermont. It gets really cold in the winter. I don't know if you heat your home, how you heat your home, but I know it as it is right
Propane.
now, very expensive to heat where I'm staying and some of the other places I'm involved in. And we can't be messing around with that. We can't have people, especially old folks, dying out in the cold. You know, it's just,
Right.
we can't have that.
Right. So, clean heat standard, that's one thing that's happening. And you, I gather, you have been speaking with some of the legislative leaders on this, Paul.
Yes.
What can you tell us?
Yes. So I did speak with, I didn't have a chance to talk to anyone yesterday at the hearing, but I did ask Ann Watson by email, who is the chair of Senate Natural Resources and Energy.
Okay.
And she did give me a response last night. Thank you very much, Ann. I know I asked on pretty short notice and asked for a quick one, so I appreciate her getting back to me. She said, "Hi, Paul, thanks for reaching out about this. I wouldn't say the clean heat standard is dead, but it's on ice for now." Nice pun. "I'd like to have a conversation with our committee about this, but I appreciate that the PUC put forward some alternatives. Since heating with renewables is cheaper, we need to help find the best path forward to get Vermonters over the cash flow hurdles that prevent them from getting to see that cheaper, more sustainable future. It's great to be able to compare options and see what is best for Vermont."
Getting us over the hurdles? What was that?
I know that's the first time you've heard that quote, isn't it, Guy?
Yeah.
I didn't actually
No,
read that
say-
to you.
Run that by me again.
I will. Let me just say it again so that you have it. She said, since heating with renewables is cheaper, we need to help find the best path forward to get Vermonters over the cash flow hurdles that prevent them from getting to the cheaper, more sustainable future.
Every
So
time.
it kind of goes back to what we were just saying. You know, it's like the artificial costs of heating in gas. I mean, gas, oil. The artificial volatile market, right? I mean, you go down in other parts of the country in the South, gas is so cheap, and they don't obviously heat their homes with oil, but and maybe some of them do, but not like we do here. It wouldn't be this volatile, shaky thing if we weren't constantly pushing these agendas in these northern states like we are. I mean, one of the things that was discussed yesterday at the hearing as well was Vermont is not the only state that's doing this. Other states are trying to do similar things, like Massachusetts, Maine, I believe, Connecticut, but it's not monolithic. They don't really have like a clear plan elsewhere. But these oil companies are like, well, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Go ahead, Mike.
So that drove me nuts every time you said it. And I know it was her words, not yours, but it is not cheaper, these new technologies. That is the entire reason for the act in the first place. If it was cheaper, we wouldn't need to mandate it by legislation. It would just come in on the free market. These are not cheaper technologies.
That's right.
They hide them in the subsidies. You don't see it on your bill. And it's still more expensive, even with the subsidies. So that is I don't know if she was being maybe disingenuous or doesn't know better, but that is not to say that's not an accurate statement would not do it justice. That is a very not true statement.
If you look at it left-handed and sideways, maybe it's sort of kind of cheaper.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that.
Well, I don't think Ann's being disingenuous. I think she's being honest from the information and the people that she rolls with. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt.
Right,
You know,
right.
she is Washington County representative. I'm not going to, I think that she does have the best interests at heart. But I just think, I don't think she has the full picture sometimes when it comes to this.
So speaking of the full picture, the idea here, Paul, is that Vermont is just so derelict in reducing its carbon emissions, and we just haven't done enough about this that we need to, do the clean heat standard. So I asked at the governor's press conference this week, I said to Julie Moore, the Agency of Natural Resources, how much money is Vermont spending, is in the state budget right now on climate change? How much are we spending? And she said $500 million is in our budget. $500 million. But obviously, we're just not doing enough. And that doesn't even count what I think both of you have just mentioned, which is the subsidies. That's just state government money. That's not what I'm paying extra for electricity because I'm being required to buy forced subsidized wind and solar.
So that actually raises a really important point as well. I have a comment here from Steve Thurston who writes, heating with renewables is impossible if the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, like right now. And to that point, once again, the whole reason we're doing this, the reason that we're pushing for this climate, green and energy alternative, it's because of climate change, right? Well, wait a minute. It's because of climate change? Well, a lot of these solar panels are coming from China, where they're making them with child and slave labor, potentially, especially where they're getting the lithium ion that go into the batteries and the other resources from the Congo, which is another thing Rogers and I spoke about.
Right.
That's a significant part of it. But so the whole reason we're doing this, well, these solar panels, a lot of them are being made in China with coal-powered plants where there is no environmental regulations, and the stuff that they're spewing, the particulate pollution into the atmosphere, is ending up in the United States. Imagine that. So what are we talking about here?
Paul used a really interesting expression. He said, we are exporting our pain.
That's right.
We're exporting our perceived pain over climate change, but some of that pain is coming back to us in the form of, as you were just saying, the super high emissions, and pollution coming back here. Now, so that was the 500 million. That's okay. We're already doing something. Paul, you also wrote another story this week on another brand new program costing a mere $62 million for low-income solar power. Some federal money, I think.
Yeah. So the state is receiving a federal grant, $62 million, and they're planning to, make it more affordable for lower-income folks to get solar panels on their houses. And I will say, the idea I'm not necessarily opposed to. Like, that was another thing that John Rogers and I spoke about in that interview is, the solar panels being at people's homes, being that close to the end user is a beautiful thing because, you're off the grid, kind of. You can be. There's ways to do it. And you're not dependent upon the volatile markets, once again, whether it's even here in Vermont what we're paying or, there's many different things. It's kind of like a decentralization of the energy grid, which I support that idea.
Well, except, Paul, that electricity in Vermont is not, as I understand it, is being sold back into the grid.
I've heard that too, yeah.
So if it were just like Mike Tagliavia, who does radio shows and is a representative, he lives off grid. I think uses solar power, but that's a different story. But anyway, so Mike, you were going to say something?
I was just going to expand on what you were just saying now. I think you mean net metering. So unless you're completely off the grid, which a small percentage, and by small I mean like it's probably less than 5%, I'm just guessing, but the vast majority of people who have the panels on the roof are selling it back have to sell it, so it's a requirement by law. They sell it back to utility, and here's the elephant in the room that a lot of folks listening probably know about. So they're charging the premium, the unsubsidized rate, or it's like 4 times what we would usually pay for electricity.
Right.
To put it in perspective, oil, natural gas, nuclear, etc., they hover in the realm of 3 to 5-ish cents per kilowatt hour, which is like the standard. And unsubsidized wind and solar. Now, I haven't checked this in like the last 5 years, but I don't think it's changed a lot. If you strip all the subsidies, it becomes like a quadruple. We're talking 20 cents to 30 cents. It's completely unsustainable.
At least 10 to 20.
Model.
Yeah. It's hugely more expensive,
right.
and utilities have to buy it.
Right.
If they make it, utilities have to buy it, and of course, people who don't have the solar panels are paying for it. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next segment.
Just quickly, there's one more piece I think we wanted to add.
Sure.
Senator Perschlick.
Oh, yeah.
So Senator Perschlick, he is one of the quotes that we mentioned in the story. He's a senator, obviously.
From where?
From Washington County, also.
Okay.
Bought my dog
okay.
from him.
Yep. I have another thing. Anyway, yeah, he's nice.
We have his dog in my
You're
house,
probably neighbors
literally.
with him, right? Aren't you?
Next town over.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
He's doing good.
Yeah, he's all right. But anyway, so he's. This is his quote from that story. He said, this early planning and collaboration will help us maximize the full economic impacts of growing solar opportunities in the state," added Andrew Perchlik, the state's Solar for All program manager. "It's important that we build trust in our communities.
Wait a minute.
Now we're ready to hit the ground running when applications launch."
Wait a minute.
What, guy? What?
He's a state senator voting on this stuff, and he's an employee of the state.
Well, that's something that
He's making his living off of this.
I'm not exactly clear about it. Is he if he's being funded by a state program he's not? Is he an employee of the state technically though? Is that what that means?
I think we need to find that out.
I think we do too.
Yeah.
We want to be sure.
Andy,
though.
if you're watching, you want to clue us in, feel free. But that's a good question. If a legislator voting on budgets that would indirectly anyway be paying his salary. Interesting. So we're going to move on to another one of our sponsors here, Randmark Corporation. Randmark Corporation, their residential building division, Village Homes, specializes in affordable, energy efficient, modular, and manufactured home projects. Their family team and skilled craftsmen have decades of experience to complete your project with ease, on time and on budget. And in addition to building homes, they're doing excavating, great folks to work with, and encourage you to check them out on their website. We have an education reporter. And education is besides energy, or maybe even more than energy, school funding, education funding is going to be front and center in this year's legislature. And Mike Belosky, our reporter here, has been sitting in on hearings and on meetings. And so, Mike, what can you tell us about what you reported this week?
Well, hi, Michael. So I did an article that ran today. I'm very happy for it. It's called. It's up on the website right now. It's got 6 comments.
Can you pull that up?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you have?
Yeah,
Great.
School funding overhaul called for by administration. Excuse me. So I'm just going to summarize some of the key points from the story.
Summarize.
So lawmakers from the House and Senate Education Committees met this week on Wednesday. They also met with the Finance Committee, Senate Finance Committee. And they also met with folks from the administration, including the new Education Secretary, Zoe Saunders.
Yep.
Hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the gist of it was it was like a bird's eye view of the current situation with financing our schools. Of course, most of our listeners know we had taxes go up 13% last year. I often, and more and more making a habit, every time I hear people mention that, I try to correct them. Yes, you are correct. Taxes did go up 13% last year, but the cost of education actually went up more than 18. And we need to remember that, because the reason it wasn't 18 and it showed up as 13 is because they used one-time money to buy that down. So actually, people keep saying it went up 13%. No, it did go up 18%, more than 18%. And that's the only reason we didn't see all that on our bill was because we had one-time money, which won't be there next year. So I feel like that's an important point that we need to keep reminding our readers and lawmakers and whoever else is listening. So anyway, so the gist of it is they are asking for like a sort of, these are my words, not theirs, but like an overhaul of the financial system. Now, I had to learn a little bit about the Brigham decision. Obviously I knew about this beforehand over the years, but I had to really kind of wrap my brain around it. So this was 1990, late 90s? What was the year? I want to say 97?
Yeah, 97, 98.
Okay, so anyway, late 90s. They passed, it was obviously a court decision, and the essence of that was that taxes, our property taxes, must go into like a pool, statewide pool, and then be redistributed with the notion that every school get an equal opportunity, whether it's a wealthy community or a poor community. So it all sounds great on paper, of course. And now fast forward about 2 decades later to today, and it's having some unintended consequences that I think Zoe Sanders did a great job at pointing out. So essentially what's ended up happening is, so when you kind of disconnect the voter from the results, so now you've got this big pool of money that all the schools are pulling from. So if you need a new gym or a new cafeteria, you can have that new gym or that new cafeteria, and it's not going to have the same bump on your tax rate as it would if just your school was paying for it, because everybody's paying for it. So in that sense, the Brigham decision worked well. The sort of unintended consequences that's starting to come to the forefront today is, I think what's been happening is wealthier communities have been like, well, it doesn't really impact our tax rate. Let's just keep building new libraries or let's buy 50,000 new computers or whatever they needed that they wanted on their Christmas list. And conversely, the poorer communities were saying, gosh, taxes are pretty high. We're going to let some people go. We're going to maybe use less classrooms or whatever they have to do. And then they were still seeing their taxes go up. And so that is this problem that's sort of been compiling over the years.
So they were seeing their taxes go up because of the socialized cost of education?
Cost, right,
Got it.
Exactly.
Got it.
That's
Okay.
And it took me like 10 years of being in Vermont writing these articles to finally, I think this week I was sitting in the cafeteria at the Statehouse and I had like an epiphany. I'm like, I got it! Because I've been writing these articles for so long and I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it. But I think the term the cart before the horse comes into play, because what you basically have is major decisions on how to spend for your education spending happening, and then they go to the state and this pool of money and say, okay, this is what we want now, help us pay for it. Whereas most of the rest of the nation follows the more model that regular folks know, which is you look at the money you have and then you decide what you're going to spend. So I don't want to put, some of this is my interpretation of what we heard, but I think that's the essence of what the message is that there's going to be some proposals from the administration to really maybe go back to a pre-Brigham type scenario, and I possibly that's a guess on my part, but this idea that we're just going to the state and saying, this is what we need for a school this year, and you, the taxpayers, and these other sources make it work. It doesn't seem like that's going to continue much longer if the administration gets their wishes. And so that was my big report for the year. I mean, not for the year, for the week.
For the whole year.
I'm done for the year now.
Well, it's a good start, though.
But it is kind of a report for the year because this is going to be an ongoing story for 2025 and beyond, of course.
What's the next thing that they're going to be discussing, do you think, on this? What's the next step?
Well, school infrastructure is going to be a big one. Folks probably have seen some of our reports over the past year. I think it was over the next, correct me if I'm wrong, over the next 2 decades or 3 decades, they anticipate something like $300 million a year that we need to fix our schools. Boy, that $500 million a year for the solar technology suddenly looks a little tempting right now. We could just grab from that and the problem be solved. You could solve that right there.
That's a really good point.
And still have 200 left over for something else.
Wow.
But anyway, so there you go. But a question that you had mentioned before the show, we were talking that we should have questions ready for the lawmakers to put forth, and I wrote down one. Are lawmakers going to look to independent schools as a model to control their spending? What I mean by that is if you look at per pupil or per student spending on average, independent schools or private schools, whatever you wish to call them, versus the public schools, almost universally across the country, it is like right about half what the independent schools are paying per student to educate them and get better results, by the way, in their testing scores and whatnot. And they're doing it at about half the cost. And I know this for a fact because my kids go to an independent school, and while I have not been on the school board, I have been at the meetings, and I have heard the numbers, and I will say that our kids, despite going to a private school, uppity, we're paying right about a third of what the rest of you are paying for your kids to be educated.
That's interesting.
Of course,
not even half, like a third.
You're still paying your property taxes.
And we still pay the property taxes on top of that, so make what you will of that.
Yeah.
But my question would be to the lawmakers, wouldn't the obvious thing to do is to look at the folks who are getting the good results and say, how are you getting those good results?
So they can do
we're
that?
getting bad results.
Well, do you think they'll do that?
I honestly, I'm sorry to say I don't think they will. And the reason why is I think, well, it's a new group this year, so maybe it won't be such the case. But if you remember when Zoe Sanders was first, when they were trying to introduce her, they were literally holding it against her that she was from the independent school sector, as if that was like a bad thing, that like a baggage that she's carrying.
Well,
I know why.
Why?
Well, I think it's because a lot of their voters are dependent on the school system. And just being honest, I've said this before on the show, and I'll say it again. My mother, she's a teacher in Northfield Elementary School, and I'm still in her healthcare program. So in one way or another, even I'm still dependent on this system, right? So if you take the whole block of voters that are out there, you got teachers, you have students, you have staffing, you have administrators. We're talking about thousands of people. That is just basically an entire voting block. If you really wanted
People whose jobs and healthcare is dependent on the public school system.
once again, same. So these systems are very much tied together, and ultimately the system as a whole. And I've been,
But
talking.
is that the job of our public school dollars to support your healthcare, Paul?
No. Well, just being frank, that's why
Yeah.
that's why my mom got into the.
Sure.
She became a teacher. She was like, oh, like this is going to work out great. We'll all be covered. Like this is important, and it is. Yeah. But the reality is, the state's constitution does not say this. It doesn't even. It doesn't say that everybody whose parents are. It says we have a right to public education, but it doesn't say through that. Right. Everybody that works in the public school system gets free health care. It's just happened to be that way. But this comes back to the really bigger conversation that's at play here. If you really want to dive into Governor Scott and his people and their team, their game, what they've been trying to do, this is at the core of it.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly it. You have an entire block of voters that 100% are dependent upon this system. But these institutions that have existed since post World War II society, for this huge baby boom generation, these institutions are completely. I don't know. They're disintegrating. They're changing. We don't have as many people going into them. We don't have a replacement.
Right.
Look at. It's not just the schools. Look at the churches, right? Look at the. That's one big one. But look at like engagement within. Other programs, right? Like the Barry Elks, for example, the Elks Club, or there's a handful I could list off, but that's not really the point of the conversation. Yeah. But you see what I mean? Yeah. It's these old school.
Maybe the institutions aren't serving us as well as they used to.
No,
they're the way we're doing it.
Well, they're becoming a burden. They're
right.
becoming it's okay. So this was meant to do a thing as a service for this, allotment of money, but now it's coming to the point where. It's almost like more about the adults. This is what Senator Brock said to me. It's more about the adults and their job security than it is about the students and the teaching.
That's backwards. Hey, Mike, I noticed on the end of your education story, you had a very interesting list there.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that. And
so,
I don't know if you can pull that up, Paul.
I got it.
So all of our stories, committee stories from now on at VDC, at Vermont Daily Chronicle, I shouldn't speak in acronyms, will have a list of the committee members with their web pages and email addresses attached. And if you want to take it a step further,
yes.
the lawmakers will hate me for
Go
saying
for
this.
No.
You could get, it's public information. It's public information, so it's there. On the Secretary of State's office, if you go to the pre-election data, so they have all the candidates that run for primaries and the general election for every 2 years, and on there is a document of all the frankly personal phone numbers of all the lawmakers. So you want to call them directly, and I was frustrated because a few years ago they tried to I think work around this. They now half of the profiles have the same phone number because it just goes to the
Sergeant
state.
Labs.
Right, so it's kind of a workaround. I didn't like that. Some of the lawmakers chose to keep the real phone numbers on their page.
Yep.
I'd say about half to 2/3 of them did not. But if you want to get around that little pivot on their part, you can just go to the Secretary of State's page, and it will have all their personal, usually more than one phone number for their direct lines. And that's public information, so it's not like I'm...
So when Mike Pulaski's phone rings at 3:30 this morning and it says, Senator so-and-so...
well, I can't get your number, but we can get theirs.
So. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, so anyway, that's something that Tim, who's going to be covering corrections and institutions, put corrections institutions names and email addresses, and Paul is at least working on getting the energy and natural resources into his stories.
I know, I'm failing at
and
it.
I am too, as well. So this is something that, because, government is supposed to be, they're your representatives. You can email them. You can tell them what you think, whether you like what they do, whether you don't, whether you have any questions, any comments. That's how democracy works, and let's use that. Now, another thing about education, John Rogers was very blunt. I encourage people to listen to this interview. This is a terrific interview you did, Paul.
Thank you.
About an hour long. You sat in this office. There's the dead thing hanging on the wall and all that in the background. But the most interesting thing to me, he said, is what he thinks maybe is going to need to happen with our schools to keep property taxes down. And he said, it's not like we're going to be building new buildings, because those are really, really expensive, as a great story that Tim wrote this week on how the state, not only is it hugely expensive just to build anything new, but the state's borrowing capacity is really reaching its limits. They borrowed so much that the lenders are a little bit not so crazy about lending more to the state of Vermont. So there's that. But anyway, what they're talking about is consolidation.
Yeah.
Small schools, little schools, rural schools, not quite one-room schoolhouse. Suddenly, sorry folks, we can't afford this anymore. If you don't want the 15 to 20% property tax increases, something's got to give. This was the point that John was making. He said, I don't want to close any schools. I really don't want to do this. But it may be that we're going to be looking at more consolidation. Instead of 2 or 3 buildings, one larger building. So anyway, this may be, and then there is the whole school choice thing. And the private schools, boy, I'm not really sure right now that they're going to be touching that, at least at this point. But I got to think some bills are going to be introduced on that. Mike, do you think there's going to be some, at least school choice legislation introduced at all?
It seems like they have a steady presence at the Statehouse every year, and maybe with the new legislature they'll finally get some traction, because every year they make a big presentation, and it's great. They have students come in and they talk about how having school choice helped them for various reasons. But it seems like the policies they're presenting haven't taken off. Maybe this will be a year something happens different with that.
Right. And speaking of which, one of the sponsors we may be bringing on soon is a private high school, and hopefully it will be official in a week or two. We shall see. But to me, it's very interesting that there are private schools out there that are thinking, we want to be players here too. So our third and final sponsor for this week's show is One Day in July. And One Day in July is the Burlington-based investment firm started by Dan Cunningham, who got the idea for it one day in July. He said he was up really late one night. He said he probably had like 4 or 5 Pepsis that day or something, and he had a lot of caffeine in him. And he said, boy, why couldn't we just do it this way? Why couldn't we? And he has sort of a novel idea for investment. One Day in July provides low fee, diversified index investment management and fiduciary financial advice for individuals, families, and institutions. Go to onedayinjuly.com to learn how to reduce fees, improve performance, avoid behavioral errors with their proprietary simulator tool and educational resources. So I've been to their office. I've sat down and had a long interview with Dan, very straight-talking, approachable guy. And I would encourage, if you want to sort of take charge of your own future, we as, folks who don't want government to solve all their problems, well, there's a certain amount of personal responsibility we need to be taking. And one of those ways is, what do we do with our money? Do we put it underneath a pillow? Or do we invest it wisely? And I think one of the options is businesses like One Day in July. So, Paul, closing up, we've got 5 minutes or so here.
Yeah, just have a couple comments that I think we should read off, seeing how
Sure.
we want to include people in on the conversation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Steve Thurston continued on. Will they also get paid, and maybe Mike, this is a good question for you, will they also get paid 3 times the market rate for their electricity? That will fall on the rest of the ratepayers. That comes back to that conversation we were having about the solar panels and net metering. So would you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, I used to joke with my wife because we would look at the solar with the subsidies, and my wife commented to me, she's like, this is a good deal. Like, we could do this, and we would save money. I said, yeah, we could even make a story about it for Vermont Daily Chronicle or something. It could be like a first-person story. But then I would joke, I would say, but if our neighbors knew what we were doing, they would egg our house. Because now they're basically paying for our house to have these on our roof. We're not, I mean, we might pay some of it, but the whole idea is getting back to the utilities having to buy it back, unless you're completely off the grid, which is different from what most of the setups are.
Right.
That's not net metering, that's different. So I think the commenter is got it right. I agree with I think I agree with the commenter if I heard it correctly.
And Steve Thurston also added, Trump should claw the program back. I don't know how that would work here in Vermont, but maybe.
Well, let me talk about that.
Sure.
Right now, there are federal subsidies.
That's right.
By both legislation and regulation for wind power and solar power, especially for solar power. The Biden administration, of course, was all over that, passing everything they can, proving everything they can. And they have 2 or 3 year windows built into them. But if both Congress and the Trump administration decided to say, you know what, we just don't want to go in that direction quite as much anymore, they could do that. And they could impose their own 5-10 year window of limited or no subsidies. They could do that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so another comment we should mention here from Robert L. Lefebvre. He writes, when Green Mountain Power sells carbon credits to out-of-state companies undermining the benefits belonging to the ratepayers, it sounds like he's saying they are undermining the benefits. In a nutshell, Vermonters are in fact paying higher rates while Green Mountain Power sells credits out of state.
That's right. And the way that works is they say, well, this is solar power, right? It's so green. It's wonderful. It doesn't make any carbon. Well, yes, that's true. But the money people have devised this sort of mechanism where they monetize that, and to some company that is burning fossil fuels, they are emitting a ton of carbon, but they have to get into some sort of imposed threshold. Well, what they do is they go to Green Mountain Power and say, can we buy your greenness? Can we buy your, not your green power. We don't want to use your green power. We just want to buy your RECs, your renewable energy credits. Yeah. And therefore, we can apply that. We can put that in the bank of green. And even if we're emitting CO2 like crazy, we're all good with the regulators because we've got Green Mountain Power's energy RECs. And that's how that works.
Yeah, it seems to me
it enables carbon pollution.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it's okay because they paid for it in this way.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of another thing that I saw out in, well, I won't get into that today, but this is an increasing, it seems like that kind of a scheme where you're able to buy energy credits or you're able to buy, I've seen other things where you're able to buy in and you get, I should write a story about it. I don't want to say anything more.
You know what's a good analogy?
There's more
here?
of this than than we're just talking about right here.
If someone is a history fan and knows about the Reformation and the Catholic Church and way back then, there was a thing called selling indulgences.
Yes. Yeah.
And where if you were a grievous sinner, you could, according to these indulgence salesmen, you could give some money and your sins would be forgiven. And the saying was, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Oh. And, I don't really know what the Almighty thought about that. But for them, it was a great device. It was, hey, we can just keep on sinning, and we got the money, and boy, what a deal. But did it really solve the problems of, carbon sin? Does it solve that problem? No, it doesn't.
That's a very, very good analogy right there.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about your John. We got 3 minutes left.
Yeah. So I just quickly, I guess we'll finish up with this.
Yep.
I did an interview with Rogers on I think it was what was it, Tuesday, or I think it was Tuesday morning, and we spoke for about 50 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. I'm very thankful to John for giving me the time that he did, because he did not have to do that. He spent more time than I had asked for, and I very much appreciate that. And taking me in there and welcoming me into his new office, man, what a moment.
Yeah.
Just to see it, being there with him, and really, quite honestly, like just thinking about the history of that room and the people that have been through there, you can really feel something there. There's something to that, and it is just it's such an honor to be able to go in there. And am I the first person to film a podcast in the Vermont Statehouse?
You could be.
I might be. I don't know. Maybe the Vermont Public or Digger, maybe they've done, but I think definitely in the Lieutenant Governor's office. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I am the first person to interview somebody for a podcast in the Lieutenant Governor's office.
Well, and John Rogers, anyway, you probably were.
Yeah,
it was like 24 hours afterwards. So yeah,
that's true. So it was cool. We talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about education. One of the big takeaways from our conversation that I had is education is going to look a lot different in the future. What I went through with the school system, I could tell, we all sensed it when we were there. It was a dying institution. I mean, I remember you would hear all the time about, back when I was in high school, we had 80 kids in our class, and meanwhile, I only had 30 kids in my class, right? And, back when I were in high school, we had varsity team, we had JV, we had this. So, the institution as a whole, it's changing. And John and I were just talking a lot about, you might not go to high school in the same way anymore. You might go to a tech school. Elementary schools might look more like family cooperatives even. I mean, independent schools do a lot of that kind of stuff. And so to the folks out there that are working in the education industry and you're maybe freaking out a little bit, if you're a teacher especially, you're going to be all right, because we still need teachers. We need people to be educating our youth. And if you're doing a nice job, you're going to find plenty of work still. People are going to be actually really looking for you when this system does start to break, because it's going to change, and it seems inevitable. And basically, that's kind of what he was getting at, and we segued that part of the conversation into entrepreneurship, or as my friend Rob Williams likes to say, Vermontrpreneurship, which I totally blanked on. I didn't say it in our podcast, but there's so many innovators in this state, and we have a strong history of it. Yes, there's a lot of people that are, living off the state, to put it shortly. But there's also a lot of creators in this state. And, just my short time in Florida, I realized just how many businesses that are out there from Vermont. It's substantially more. I mean, per capita, right? I mean, all these different references I heard when I was down there to our little Green Mountain state, it's incredible.
It's not just Ben and Jerry's.
It's not just Ben and Jerry's. Yeah. I could go name off a list of them, and I'll spare you the pain right now. But point is, what's that next innovation going to be?
Yeah.
And where's that going to come from? Well, our education system isn't setting people up as it stands right now for that to happen, but maybe in the future it will be. So this tech hub that they're putting up in Essex Junction, getting these minds and these businesses and these entrepreneur businesses around each other, what could come out of that? Wow. Where could this go? Maybe we could create some type of renewable energy that truly is sustainable and isn't polluting in one way or another, some backhanded way. You know,
interesting. We're going to close with this, but right before the show, Tim was saying Vermont has got people who are very knowledgeable about thorium reactors, thorium nuclear reactors, which is an incredibly safe, incredibly stable nuclear reactor. There's a guy named Bob Hargraves, Meredith Angwin over in Norwich, or Wilder, I'm sorry. And you know what? We should have Bob Hargraves, if you're listening, and Meredith, we want you to come on the show. We want you to talk about what could this mean to Vermont. And now with that, whoa.
One last thing. I know it's
Yes, Paul.
5:01, but I just wanted to share this cartoon that we had. We spoke just quickly about it.
Oh, okay.
This is the cartoon of John Rogers throwing out all of David Zuckerman's stuff. This was published, I think it was on Times Argus and VT Digger. Or
I think it was Tim Newcomb and probably 7 Days in the Times Argus, is my guess.
I just wanted to show it because it's funny. There's Rogers holding the menstrual products. Need me, ask some. Geez, you really don't have to get rid of everything. Oh, yes, I do. So it was an honor to be in there. Thank you again to John, and that's all I have on that.
Okay. And I've been told by my wife that when we sign off, the weirdness of technology is when I say, and now folks, the show's over, see you next time, and Paul hits the button, it actually ends up cutting it off like 5 seconds, so it makes me sound like choppy or whatever. So Paul, if you could take that into account.
Yes, thank you for reminding me.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
And anyway, let's see if he does it. Thank you very much, Paul Bean, Mike Bolosky, Tim Page, and thank you for joining us and for sharing your comments and for giving us your attention. And we hope you have a blessed weekend, and we'll see you again Friday at 4.